Good evening and welcome to October's episode of Power of the Prosecutor. I am Monique Worrell, your state attorney, and it is so great to be with you this evening. I know that here in Central Florida, we've just gone through the Hurricane Ian, and it's gone up the coast as well. So many of us are dealing with the aftermath of hurricane damage and the disaster that it left behind us. I pray that you and your families are well and that you all are getting the assistance that you need. I know that there are many individuals who are coming to our aid and to our assistance to ensure that we are able to recover from this disaster. With that being said, we are also in October, and the month of October is where we bring awareness to domestic violence. And I am very excited to have with us this evening Charlotte McCullough, a licensed mental health therapist. Charlotte, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, State Attorney Worrell. I'm excited to be here to talk about this important topic for our community.
Absolutely. So, as I said, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And as a licensed family and relationship therapist, I'm eager to hear your insight on healthy relationships, but more broadly, how can we prioritize mental health and wellness in this context?
Yes. So, hello?
Yes.
Okay, I'm here. It blinked. Okay, so I think there are two very important topics, and I think they go together very well. When we talk about domestic violence, one of the things that I really would like to get out to our community when we talk about domestic violence is just not about anger management. And I think a lot of people, when they think of domestic violence, they think of just someone who's walking around just angry and mean. But when we talk about domestic violence, I want to talk more about power and control, that pattern, that intentional pattern of behavior of having power and control over a partner. And the effects of that can lead to mental illness, definitely anxiety, depression, and, a lot of emotional abuse goes along with domestic violence too, which are those silent wounds that a lot of us carry when it comes to domestic violence.
Now, in the realm of domestic violence, we hear the terms power and control used a lot. And sometimes when you say things, often they just kind of become a theme and they lose meaning and they become just words. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? What is power and control, and how does it relate to domestic violence?
Yes. So when we talk about power and control, and it's so true what you said, State Attorney Worrell, it's like these words, we've used them so often, they've just become like kind of numb to everybody. And domestic violence, when we talk about it, it's very visible, but it has become so invisible because these things we've just become accustomed to. So when we talk about power and control, what it actually looks like in relationships is more or less of a person not being able to make decisions for themselves. A person, when you're in this relationship, is more like walking on eggshells. It's more of like you can't make decisions on your own of who you can be around, who you can form relationships with. All of that is in the control of someone else. And also, in today's time, we have all of this technology. So things like trackers on your car, things like monitoring your social media, not allowing you to have freedom to connect with people on social media, not being able to connect with people who you love, parents, children, keeping you isolated. And when we talk about domestic violence, I like to talk about what it actually looks like, because when we say things like power and control, people just think of power and control, but when we talk about this, I like to give vivid examples of this for our community, because some people can totally be in this situation and not think that they're in this situation, and it goes back to sometimes with our family of origin, some things that we've seen in our childhood and experience, we've normalized it. But I think situations or conversations like this brings awareness to that and brings it to our conscious to really assess if we are in this situation or someone we love is in this situation of domestic violence.
Now, one of the goals of Power of the Prosecutor is to educate and inform. Power of the Prosecutor is a vehicle that I created to educate and inform the community on topics that really matter. And I think that this is one of those topics that's extremely important. And an
Yes.
important goal of this conversation is to help reduce the stigma associated with domestic violence. Now, one of the things you said is that sometimes people are in it and they don't want help to get out of it. And there is a stigma that's associated with domestic violence.
Yeah.
So can you help us set the foundation for the conversation? How is domestic violence defined?
So when you talk about domestic violence, like I was saying earlier, it's more about power and control. It's that intentional pattern behavior of power and control over your partner. You know, that whole thing around it's totally in the power of another person to make decisions for you. And that's what, when we talk about domestic violence, that's the thing, that's the definition that I want to get across. It's the intentional pattern of behavior of power and control over a person, not just meanness, not just disagreements. That's not what it is, because you can have disagreements in relationships, but it's more or less about a pattern of behaviors around power and control. And when, just to make a difference with it, it's a pattern, right, of power and control. So if this person can go to work and this behavior of power and control does not come out, but it's totally at home with you specifically or with your children, that's what domestic violence look like. Because some people say, well, they're so nice, you know, they don't do that at work, or they don't do that at church, or they don't do that at our group meetings. But behind the scenes, you know, their spouse, their partner is saying, this is what happens to me behind the scene. It's that pattern, intentional pattern of power and control over a person.
That's really important, really important. So, you know, many of cases that come into our office involve a domestic dispute of some sort. So this topic certainly ties back into the criminal legal system. Here are some sobering statistics. According to the FBI, 40% of female and 20% of male homicides result from domestic violence. 72% of murder-suicides involve intimate partners, and 94% of those murder victims are female.
Yes.
When I read those statistics, I was absolutely blown away by that. Talk to us a little bit about how real that is, and how sometimes we think that something is really small and it's just an argument or a dispute between individuals. But when we see those statistics of the fatality rates, how important that is.
This is very real. That's why one of the things that we do as clinicians is we're constantly assessing couples, because I see couples. One of my specialties is seeing couples, and I'm constantly assessing for that, either historical violence or current, because it is very, very real. And it's right here in our neighborhoods. It's right here in our communities around couples really having issues around domestic violence, or really being abused emotionally, physically, mentally. And this isn't just for heterosexual couples. It also affects the LGBTQ community as well when we talk about domestic violence.
So what are some signs that someone could be in an unhealthy relationship?
And that's a very good question. I think one of the things that we throw out a lot now is toxic relationships, or relationships that are just not healthy. One of the things that you can look for is the obvious one, physical abuse. Another one is when you aren't able to speak about your emotions in a relationship, when you're not free to come and go as you want to in a relationship, or if you're experiencing a lot of jealousy. Your partner is very jealous of all of your relationships, don't want you to connect with any groups, don't want you to go to church, don't want you talking to the neighbors, just fully isolating you. Those are the things. And sometimes as women, some of us who have, wounds of abandonment and things like that, we kind of think like the jealousy is cute, or he just loved me so much. But there's a difference between someone being concerned about you and someone controlling you. It looks totally different, and when your partner is finding fault with everyone in your life that you have fun with or you connect with, that's a telltale sign as well. Also, if you're not able to make your own decisions around finances, if you're not able to make your own decisions around what clothing you want to wear, Those are some alarming things when it comes to domestic violence in a relationship. And I always go back to the obvious one: physical abuse, aggressiveness, punching holes in walls, killing your animals or abusing your animals, abusing the things that your children love, not allowing you to eat when you want to eat. All of those things are some signs of toxic, very unhealthy relationships.
You hit on a point that struck me as soon as you began speaking. There are some instances where someone might think that that's concern, or he loves me, or that's how he expresses love towards me. And it's interesting that you pointed back to what would be a root cause of that thought process, is that if someone experienced abandonment or they weren't shown love in a positive fashion, that they don't really know what it looks like, and they might be confused into thinking that those signs are an expression of love. But what you're
Absolutely.
saying to us is that actually it can be, not always, but it can be an expression of a potential for domestic violence.
Yes, absolutely. And it's case by case, it's person by person. But I always say this to women, State Attorney Worrell: if you have that feeling internally, like this don't feel right, trust that. If you have that feeling of like, ooh, that make me cringe, ooh, that was mean, or ooh, that was cold, check it. Trust that what you're feeling in your gut. You make good decisions. A lot of times when you're in domestic violence situations, the person try to make you feel guilty around making your own decisions. And that guilt and shame can make you stay in that situation or make you deny that anything is going on in that relationship. But you do make good decisions. Gaslighting is one that is very prevalent in domestic violence relationships, when you're told that what you're feeling is not real or you're crazy for feeling that. But if you feel that feeling inside, 9 times out of 10, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, that's really important.
Mhm.
Really important that people trust their own judgment, right? That they
Yes,
trust themselves and that they trust what they're feeling, and not to second guess their feelings.
yes. And it's okay. Shame and guilt, a lot of us carry that. Shame is that internal piece. I'm just a bad person. Guilt is that part of I did something bad, and being stuck in that place. But allowing yourself to be free, like, hey, I feel bad. This feels strange. This does not feel like love. This feels more like I'm afraid. I'm afraid to come home. I'm afraid to use my own phone. I'm afraid to connect with people because if this person finds out, it's going to be a whole situation. So it shuts me down. I just will not do anything. I will not move unless they give me permission to move. That's a sign that you're in a very toxic relationship.
Now, does domestic violence have a typical victim? Is there anything typical about a domestic violence victim?
So a lot of people like to think like, oh, it's mainly men are the ones that are the abusers. But there are women who are abusers also. And domestic violence goes across all ethnicities, all socioeconomic statuses, all genders, all races. It's across the board. It's not only prevalent in this community or this household. It's across the board. And that's why as a clinician, I'm constantly assessing for historical and current physical abuse, domestic violence, yelling, screaming, all of those things we're constantly assessing for, because this does not have a typical face to it or a typical look to it, but it's really for all people. And that's why I think it's so important for our community to have these types of conversations. This isn't just for one race, one type of person, one gender. It's for all. This can happen to anyone in any household, any age as well.
Yeah. A lot of times we have people who have come in as victims of domestic violence into our office, and they no longer want to go forward with charges against the individual who has harmed them. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because someone wants to drop the charges, does that mean that they weren't involved in domestic violence?
No, it doesn't mean that they weren't. I don't think that it means that they were not. Sometimes that can be a consequence of going forward with charges. They can be afraid that things will get worse. And sometimes in our communities, we say things like, well, if it got that bad, just leave. It's not that easy to just leave. It's not easy to just uproot your children or change jobs and do different things like that. That's why we do have those shelters and things like that in our community. But just expressing some empathy, I think when you do experience someone who's going through that and they want to drop charges, or they're saying like, no, I don't want to get involved, understand where they're coming from. It's not that they want to protect this person, but they're afraid for their lives and afraid for their children and things like that. I mean, it's not so much that they don't want to, but sometimes when women are in these situations, they feel like there is nowhere else for me to go. I don't have anything. I don't have any resources. I don't have anyone to help me. So I've been going through it this long. So, I'll just continue going through it.
What would you say is the best way as a community for us to support individuals who find themselves in situations like that?
One, this conversation on this podcast is a very good community resource, I think, for this. So talking about it, having candid conversations, normalizing conversations about domestic violence, not just saying DV, say the whole word, domestic violence, putting things up at work about domestic violence, making it very obvious where women can get help when they're in these domestic violence situations. Also, going and getting involved with our local shelters here in the Orlando area, volunteering there or giving financially to those things. Those of you that can't get involved, but giving financially to those organizations. And I think the main thing, State Attorney, is to normalize this by talking about it, not allowing domestic violence to be invisible, talking about it and normalizing talks around domestic violence and what it looks like in our community.
How would you recommend that we reduce domestic disputes and build healthier personal relationships?
So one is, like I said earlier, trusting our gut. When we're in these bad situations or we're starting relationships or we're feeling like something is off, trusting that and moving away from it. Also allowing ourselves to get help. One of the things, a lot of times, strong women, strong men, one thing we do is we move away from help when we need it. But when we're talking about domestic violence, really reaching out for help, having that trusted person that you can talk to. And if someone comes to you talking about domestic violence, try not to share it with everyone in your social circle, but lead them towards help. There's so many things here in our area that we can do for help. There's a 1-800 number for the domestic hotline I'm going to share. There's our shelters here in this area that we can lead them to. But literally thinking about if you were a person that was sharing something that was near and dear to your heart or something that you was embarrassed about, would you want that person to go and share it with everyone else? And when you do that, you are really, really feeding into that guilt and shame they're already feeling, so literally holding space for someone and leading them to help, being that ear when they do come to you. If they're not ready to go just yet or leave, but be that ear. There's a big, big help in just listening.
And that was really going to be my next question for you. How do we support those who choose to stay? And then how do we support those who are leaving those unhealthy relationships?
And that's a very, very real situation. So those that want to stay, I think listening to them when they are ready to talk, listening to them and moving away from pointing the finger. They already know they're in a bad situation. That's why they come to you and talk to you about it. But being realistic with them and telling them we have resources. If you're ready to leave, when you're ready to leave, making a safety plan with them, leading them to a counselor, leading them to someone else that can help them get out of that situation and talk them through that situation that they are in.
Now, switching gears just a little bit, many times in our community, access to mental health support or treatment seems like it's out of reach. Therapy or counseling might be too expensive or unattainable. How accessible is relationship and family therapy?
So, here in Orlando, the Central Florida area, we have so many therapists that are available. There are a number of places that we can go to find therapists. Also, there's free counseling available for families and individuals at the Mental Health Association of Central Florida, which is the Outlook Clinic. You can call there. We have services there for the uninsured. Also, 26 Health here in our area, they offer mental health services to the LGBTQ community, also free of charge or a sliding fee scale for residents here in our area.
So in addition to working with couples and families to build healthier relationships, you're also a mental health advocate. Now,
Yes.
our office is fortunate to have mental health experts leading the review of cases that have a mental health component. And these experts apply a critical eye and professional experience in taking mental illness into consideration when deciding the outcomes of cases. As prosecutors, we're continually educating ourselves on the impact of mental illness in the criminal legal system. And it's important to remember that mental illness is actually common. In a given year, 18.9% of US adults experience some form of mental illness. 4.5% have a serious mental illness. And among the 46.6 million adults with any mental illness, 19.8 million received mental health services in the last year. How is mental illness defined? Because I think those numbers are probably shocking to individuals that mental illness is that prevalent. But would you define what is mental illness?
So when we talk about mental illness, it's more or less of a diagnosed mental disorder. But when we talk about mental illness, I like to shed light on there is a difference between mental illness and mental health. We all have mental health, but we all don't have a mental illness. And there's this dichotomy that if I don't have a mental illness, I am mentally healthy. And that's just not true. Mental health has a lot to do with how do you cope? What are your coping skills and strategies to deal with everyday life stressors, And sometimes all of us are challenged with mental health, at times. But you can have a mental illness and be mentally healthy. But you can not have an illness and not be mentally healthy. It's how you're dealing with your day-to-day stressors.
Thank you so much for that. So you said earlier that you were going to provide resources for domestic violence, and I think you might also have some resources for mental health support as well. Could you provide those resources for our viewers?
Yes. So for the Outlook Clinic, for the uninsured, for mental health and psychiatric care, the phone number is 407-898-0110. And for the LGBTQ community at 26 Health, for mental health services, that's counseling as well as psychiatric services. The phone number is 321-800-2922. And then the National Domestic Violence Hotline, I would like to share as well. You can text or call this number, 800-799-7233. Also, this year, starting July 16th, we have a crisis line that we can use. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline is 988. You can text or call that number from your cell phone, and there are trained professional counselors there to help you walk through any crisis that you call about.
Now, I know my team is going to make sure that those numbers are put into the chat and hosted on our page as well, because it's so important that this information is shared with the community. Like I said, the purpose of Power of Prosecutor is to inform and educate the community. And I can't think of a matter or an issue that's more important in which to educate and inform the community. So with that, you've given them resources, you've told them who to call and where to call, but there might be someone right now who wishes that they could talk to you. So can you tell our viewers and our listeners, how would they connect with you?
Yes, you can always go to my website. It's www.shirlettemccullough.com. You can also call us at 407-230-4582. My email address is Shirlette@ShirletteMcCullough.com. I'm also on Facebook, Shirlette McCullough. I'm also on Instagram, Shirlette_McCullough.
Wow. That is Shirlette McCullough. And thank you so much for joining me this evening for Power of the Prosecutor. The information that you shared has been extremely helpful, and I know that this will be a resource that will be viewed for many times to come in the future. Thank you so much for taking a part of your evening to spend with us. I really appreciate you being here on Power of the
Thank you.
Prosecutor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And make sure that you join us next month for Power of the Prosecutor. It will be on November the 7th. And again, I am Monique Worrell, your state attorney, and thank you for being here with me this evening for Power of the Prosecutor. Good night.